The storm before the courtroom. The pale winter sun hung low over the courthouse, casting long, cold shadows across the stone steps. 12-year-old Emily Walker adjusted her scarf as a gust of wind tugged at her dark curls. Her small frame braced against the chill. Her mother, Layla Walker, strode confidently beside her, heels clicking sharply with each determined step. Emily glanced up at the towering building, the weight of its presence pressing down on her as the knot in her stomach tightened. "Emily, stand up straight," Layla snapped, her voice cutting through the crisp air like a knife. Her polished exterior, perfectly styled hair, a designer coat, and a face painted with careful precision belied the tension lurking just beneath her practiced smile. "Remember, today's important. You're to do exactly as I say." "Yes, Mom," Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. Her hands tightened around the edges of her scarf as she cast her eyes downward. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with quiet chaos. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered amongst themselves, and the scent of coffee lingered faintly in the air. Lila greeted her attorney, Victor Haynes, with a firm handshake and a look of cool confidence. "Victor," she said curtly, "everything is set." Victor nodded, his expression calm but serious. "We're ready. Just remember to stay composed. Judge Peterson is sharp, and appearances will matter." Emily trailed behind them, her presence barely acknowledged. She tugged her scarf tighter, a futile attempt to shield herself from the icy tension that seemed to radiate from her mother. Her gaze wandered the crowded hallway until it landed on a familiar face across the room. Her father, Jack Walker, stood near the entrance, his posture straight but his eyes scanning the crowd. He wore a simple navy suit, his sandy hair neatly combed, and a glint of determination in his eyes. Beside him, his lawyer, Amelia Quinn, spoke in hushed tones, but Jack's attention was elsewhere. It was on Emily. The moment their eyes met, the noise of the courthouse seemed to fade. A faint smile touched Jack's lips, and Emily's heart skipped. Without thinking, she lifted a hand in a small wave, a flicker of hope sparking within her. Jack's smile widened as he nodded back, a silent promise conveyed in his gaze. "Emily." Layla's voice shattered the moment like glass. She turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as she noticed her daughter's line of sight. "What are you doing?" "And nothing," Emily stammered, quickly dropping her hand. Layla's eyes darted toward Jack, her lips curling in disdain. "Don't even think about it. Stay by my side and remember what we discussed. No foolishness." Emily nodded mutely, her shoulders hunched as Layla led her away toward the courtroom doors. A meeting of eyes. Across the hall, Jack's hands tightened into fists at his sides as he watched Layla tug Emily along like a marionette on strings. Amelia's voice drew his attention back. "Jack," she said gently, her tone laced with understanding. "I know this isn't easy, but today is your chance. We have everything we need to make a solid case." Jack exhaled, his jaw tight. "I know, but seeing her like that, it's like she's disappearing right in front of me. She doesn't even look like herself anymore." Amelia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight for her, Jack. You've done everything right. Just stay calm." The courtroom doors creaked open, and a bailiff's voice called out, "Walker versus Walker. All parties, please enter." Inside the courtroom. The room was imposing, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb the light. Emily sat stiffly next to Layla, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Jack settled into his seat beside Amelia, his posture a mix of tension and determination. The judge entered, and all rose as the bailiff's voice echoed, announcing the start of the proceedings. Judge Peterson, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of authority, took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses and addressed the courtroom. "This case, Walker versus Walker, concerns the petition to revisit the custody agreement of minor Emily Walker. The petitioner, Mr. Jack Walker, alleges new evidence of neglect and misconduct on the part of the custodial parent, Ms. Layla Walker. Both sides will have the opportunity to present their case. Let's begin with opening statements. Amelia rose first, her voice measured and confident as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, this case is about the safety and well-being of a child who has been failed by the system. Over the next several hours, we will present evidence that demonstrates not only neglect but active harm caused by Ms. Layla Walker's actions. Our goal is simple: to ensure Emily Walker is placed in a safe, nurturing environment where she can thrive. As Amelia spoke, Layla's jaw tightened, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. When it was Victor's turn, he stood with equal poise. Your Honor, he began smoothly, Ms. Layla Walker has been a devoted mother, providing for Emily's every need under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. This is not a case of neglect. It is a case of a father seeking to disrupt a child's stability out of personal grievances. We will prove that Emily's best interests lie with her mother. Layla leaned back in her chair, her confidence seemingly restored, but Jack noticed the slight twitch in her expression, the cracks starting to show. Emily's perspective. Throughout the opening statements, Emily sat in silence, her gaze flickering between the adults arguing over her future. Her heart raced as she stole glances at her father, a desperate longing pulling her toward him. But Layla's sharp gaze kept her rooted in place, her mother's words from earlier echoing in her mind. Stay quiet, Emily. Leave the talking to us. Don't do anything to embarrass me. But as the proceedings unfolded, a seed of rebellion began to take root in Emily's heart. She thought of the times her father had been her safe haven, the quiet nights when he'd read her stories, and the warm, unshakable love he'd shown. It was a stark contrast to the cold, demanding presence of her mother. For the first time, Emily wondered, could her voice make a difference? Shadows of the past. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as the first witness was called to the stand. Jack's lawyer, Amelia Quinn, had a quiet confidence as she approached the podium. Your Honor, she began, we'd like to call Dr. Rachel Miller, Emily's school counselor, to testify about her observations regarding Emily's well-being over the past year. A tall, soft-spoken woman stepped forward. Dr. Miller adjusted her glasses nervously as she sat in the witness chair and took the oath. Layla's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her composed exterior, her fingers steepled under her chin. Dr. Miller, Amelia started, can you tell us about your interactions with Emily Walker? Dr. Miller nodded. Emily has been my student for the past 3 years. She is an exceptionally bright and creative child, but over the past year, I've noticed significant changes in her behavior. Can you elaborate on these changes? Amelia prompted. Dr. Miller glanced toward Emily, who sat quietly beside her mother, looking small and uncertain. She's become withdrawn. Her teachers reported she's often distracted in class, and she's been missing assignments. When I tried to discuss these issues with her, she seemed anxious and reluctant to speak. Amelia nodded sympathetically. Did she ever confide in you about her home life? Dr. Miller hesitated, then answered carefully. Yes. During one of our sessions, Emily mentioned feeling unsafe at home. She described her mother being very angry and said she sometimes gets punished for things she doesn't understand. She also said she doesn't always have access to her medication. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Layla stiffened, her calm mask cracking slightly as she leaned over to whisper furiously to her attorney. Amelia continued, and did you take any action based on these concerns? Yes, Dr. Miller replied. I filed a report with Child Protective Services, but the investigation was inconclusive at the time due to a lack of evidence. Emily was too afraid to speak in detail. Amelia's expression softened. Thank you, Dr. Miller. No further questions. Victor rose next, his expression sharp and focused. Dr. Miller, you've mentioned Emily's reluctance to speak. Is it possible she exaggerated or misinterpreted events due to stress from her illness? Dr. Miller frowned slightly. It's possible, but unlikely. Her accounts were consistent over time and matched other observations. Victor nodded, clearly unsatisfied. Thank you, Dr. Miller. Lila's facade cracks. As Dr. Miller stepped down, Lila's grip on the edge of the table tightened. She leaned toward Victor, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to discredit every single witness. Do you hear me? Victor glanced at her, his expression strained. Lila, I can only work with the facts. If there's more I need to know, now is the time to tell me. There's nothing to tell, Lila snapped. Just do your job. Across the aisle, Jack's lawyer called the next witness, Maria Daniels, a neighbor who lived next door to Lila and Emily. Maria was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wasted no time getting to the point. I've lived next door to Ms. Walker for 5 years, Maria began, her voice steady. At first, everything seemed normal, but in the past year, I've started noticing disturbing things. Amelia encouraged her to elaborate. What kind of things? Well, Maria said, glancing at Emily with a sympathetic look, there were times I'd hear shouting, angry, violent shouting. Sometimes I'd hear Emily crying. Once, I found her outside on my porch in the middle of the night. She said her mom had locked her out after an argument. Emily's head dropped lower, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. Lila's face turned an alarming shade of red, but she stayed silent, glaring daggers at Maria. What did you do when you found Emily? Amelia asked. I brought her inside and let her sleep on my couch. The next morning, I walked her back home. Lila was dismissive, said it was just a misunderstanding. Did you report this incident to anyone? Maria hesitated. I didn't. I regret that now. At the time, I thought it might just be a one-off incident, and I didn't want to make things worse for Emily. Amelia gave Maria a reassuring smile. Thank you for coming forward today. No further questions. Victor's cross-examination was brief and pointed. Ms. Daniels, you've admitted to not reporting these incidents. Isn't it possible that what you witnessed was exaggerated in your mind, or that you misunderstood the situation? Maria's expression hardened. I didn't misunderstand anything. A scared child showed up at my door, and that wasn't the first or the last time I heard shouting from that house. Victor didn't press further. He could feel the tide turning against his client. A daughter's strength. The courtroom was electric with tension as Amelia stood to call the next witness. Emily herself. Lila's face twisted in outrage. This is ridiculous, she hissed to Victor. She's just a child. Victor leaned closer, his voice low. If she takes the stand, anything she says could determine the outcome. Control yourself. Emily's small frame seemed even smaller as she was sworn in and took her seat. The judge addressed her gently. Emily, thank you for being here today. I know this must be difficult, but it's very important that we hear from you. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Amelia approached her, her tone soft and encouraging. Emily, can you tell us what life has been like at home with your mom? Emily hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to Lila. For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't answer. Then, her gaze shifted to her father. Jack's steady, reassuring presence gave her the courage to speak. It's hard, Emily began, her voice trembling. Mom gets angry a lot. She yells at me. Sometimes she hits me. Lila shot to her feet. She's lying, she screamed, her voice shrill. The judge's gavel came down hard. Ms. Walker, sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt of court. Shaking with rage, Lila sank back into her seat, muttering under her breath. Emily flinched at the outburst but continued. She locks me in my room sometimes, Emily said, tears streaming down her face. I miss my dad. He always made me feel safe. Amelia's voice was gentle but firm. Emily, has your mom ever kept you from taking your medicine? Yes, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Sometimes the cabinet is locked, and she forgets the key. Amelia gave Emily a moment to collect herself before asking her final question. Emily, What do you want the court to know? Emily looked directly at the judge, her tears drying as she found her resolve. I want to live with my dad. I'm scared at home, and I don't want to be scared anymore. The shift. Emily's testimony sent a ripple through the courtroom. Even Leila seemed stunned into silence, her mouth slightly open as she stared at her daughter. Jack felt a surge of pride and heartbreak as he watched his daughter's courage shine through. As Emily stepped down, the judge called for a recess, leaving the courtroom buzzing with tension. Outside, Leila cornered Emily, her nails digging into the girl's arm. How dare you say those things? Leila hissed, her voice low and venomous. Do you know what you've done? Emily pulled away, tears streaming again. I told the truth, Mom. Jack, noticing the interaction, stepped forward. Let her go, Leila. Leila spun around, her composure completely shattered. This is your fault. You've poisoned her against me. Security quickly intervened, pulling Leila back as Jack scooped Emily into his arms. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The facade crumbles. The courtroom felt heavier than before as the recess ended. The doors creaked open, and the judge re-entered, her expression stern but composed. The bailiff called the session back into order, and the tension was palpable as everyone resumed their seats. Leila sat stiffly, her face a mask of controlled fury, while Jack remained calm, his focus on Emily. She sat between her court-appointed advocate and Jack's lawyer, Amelia Quinn, her small hands gripping the edges of her chair. Judge Peterson cleared her throat. We will now proceed with the testimony of the petitioner, Mr. Jack Walker. Jack rose from his seat and approached the witness stand. He moved with quiet determination, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's as he passed. He took the oath, his voice steady, and sat down, hands folded in his lap. Amelia began her questioning with precision and care. Mr. Walker, can you describe your relationship with Emily before the custody arrangement 3 years ago? Jack smiled faintly, a touch of nostalgia softening his features. Emily and I were very close. We'd spend weekends building science projects, reading her favorite books, and going to the park. She loved the swings and could spend hours just laughing and playing. She was my world. Emily's lips twitched into a small smile, remembering those carefree days, but it faded as Jack continued. That all changed after the custody ruling. I was allowed only supervised visits, and even those were sparse. Leila often canceled at the last minute or claimed Emily wasn't feeling well. I tried to fight for more time, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening. Leila made sure the court saw me as an unfit father. I lost everything. Amelia nodded sympathetically. And why are you petitioning the court now to revisit custody? Jack exhaled deeply. Because I've seen what this arrangement has done to my daughter. She's not the same Emily I knew. She's withdrawn, anxious, and afraid. When I did manage to see her, I noticed bruises and signs of neglect. She admitted to me that she doesn't always get her medicine, and I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Amelia's tone grew serious. What steps did you take after noticing these signs? I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, consulted with her school and medical professionals, and filed this petition. My goal has always been to protect Emily and ensure she has a safe, loving environment. Amelia paused before asking her final question. Mr. Walker, if the court grants you custody, what would you do differently? Jack's voice was firm. I would make Emily my priority. I've adjusted my work schedule to be present for her, and I've taken courses on parenting a child with serious medical needs. I will ensure she gets the care, attention, and love she deserves. The defense strikes back. Victor rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp and calculated. Mr. Walker, you mentioned you were close to Emily before the divorce. Can you explain why your marriage to Ms. Walker ended? Jack's jaw tightened. Leila and I had different priorities. I wanted a stable, nurturing environment for Emily. Leila had other ideas. Other ideas. Victor pressed. Could you elaborate? Jack hesitated, then said carefully, "She prioritized appearances over substance. She was more concerned with what others thought than what was best for Emily." Victor smirked. "And you think that's a reason to dissolve a marriage? Isn't it true you worked long hours and were often absent?" "I worked to provide for my family," Jack shot back, his voice firm. "And I always made time for Emily." Victor's expression hardened. "Yet the court found you unfit 3 years ago. Isn't it possible that this petition is a way to undermine Ms. Walker rather than protect Emily?" Jack's eyes blazed with restrained anger. "This petition is about Emily's safety, nothing else." Victor nodded curtly, sensing he wasn't gaining ground. "No further questions, Your Honor." The turning point. As Jack stepped down, the judge turned her attention to Leela. "Ms. Walker, you've heard the allegations against you. Would you like to take the stand?" Leela hesitated, her gaze darting between Victor and Emily. Finally, she rose, her head held high, and approached the witness stand. She swore the oath, her voice steady, but tinged with defiance. Victor began. "Ms. Walker, can you describe your role as Emily's primary caregiver?" "I've done everything for my daughter," Leela said confidently. "I've managed her medical care, her schooling, and every aspect of her life. It hasn't been easy, but I've done my best." Victor nodded approvingly. "And how would you respond to the allegations of neglect and abuse?" Leela's expression hardened. "They're lies. Fabrications by Jack to make himself look better. He's always been good at playing the victim." Victor pressed further. "What about the financial evidence presented earlier? The claims that child support funds were misused?" Leela's lips tightened. "That money was used for household expenses. Raising a child with leukemia isn't cheap, and I've had to make sacrifices to keep things afloat." Her words hung in the air, but the courtroom sensed the cracks in her narrative. The moment of truth. Amelia's cross-examination began with a calm, measured tone. "Ms. Walker, you stated you've done everything for Emily. Can you explain why her school counselor and medical records show missed appointments and untreated injuries?" Leela bristled. "Those records are taken out of context. I've always made Emily's health a priority." "And yet," Amelia continued, "we've seen evidence of frequent absences from medical appointments in school. Can you account for those?" Leela faltered, her composure slipping. "Emily was sick. Sometimes she didn't feel like going, and I did what I could." Amelia pressed on. "Ms. Walker, Emily testified that you locked her out of the house and withheld her medication. How do you respond to that?" "That's ridiculous," Leela snapped. "She's a child. She doesn't understand how hard I've worked to keep us afloat." Amelia's voice grew firmer. "Hard enough to spend child support funds on luxury items, alcohol, and vacations." Leela's face flushed. I deserve some happiness too, after everything I've been through." "Ms. Walker," Amelia interrupted, her voice cutting through the air. "This isn't about you. It's about Emily. And everything we've seen today suggests you've put your needs above hers." Leela's mouth opened, but no words came. The weight of the evidence and testimony pressed down on her, and for the first time, her confident facade shattered. She slumped back in her chair, defeated. Emily's courage. As the day drew to a close, Judge Peterson addressed the courtroom. "This case has presented serious allegations and deeply concerning evidence. I will take the night to review all materials and reconvene tomorrow for my ruling. Until then, I urge all parties to remain civil." The courtroom emptied slowly, tension thick in the air. As Jack and Amelia gathered their papers, Emily hesitated before rushing to her father. She wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. Jack knelt to her level, holding her tightly. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart. You were so brave today." Across the room, Leela watched the exchange, her face a mixture of anger and despair. For the first time, the reality of her actions seemed to settle on her shoulders. As the courthouse lights dimmed, Emily clung to the hope that tomorrow might bring a brighter future. The weight of truth. The next morning, the courthouse was bathed in the pale light of dawn. The cold air carried an air of anticipation, heavy with the echoes of the prior day's revelations. Inside, the tension was palpable as the courtroom began to fill. Lawyers, court staff, and curious onlookers took their places, their whispers weaving an uneasy hum of speculation. Emily sat quietly beside her court-appointed advocate, Maria, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. The bruises on her scalp, hidden beneath her wig, were a stark reminder of the life she desperately wanted to escape. Across the aisle, Jack sat beside Amelia, his gaze steady and comforting whenever Emily dared to glance his way. Leela, however, was a stark contrast. Her once pristine demeanor was fraying at the edges. Her makeup, though still meticulously applied, couldn't mask the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. She sat stiffly beside Victor, who spoke to her in hushed, urgent tones. Her responses were curt, her jaw clenched, as though holding back the storm brewing within. Judge Peterson entered the courtroom promptly at 9 a.m., her expression as unreadable as ever. The gavel struck, and the room fell silent. "Good morning," the judge began, her voice measured. "Before we continue with closing arguments, I have decided to allow additional testimony from one final witness." Leela's eyes widened in panic. She turned to Victor, whispering harshly, "What witness?" "He didn't mention this." Victor shook his head, clearly caught off guard. "I don't know, but we'll handle it." Judge Peterson looked toward Amelia. "Ms. Quinn, please proceed." Amelia rose, her movements confident but deliberate. "Your Honor, I would like to call Officer Daniel Rice to the stand." An unexpected witness. A uniformed police officer entered the courtroom, his presence commanding respect. He was a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on the judge. After being sworn in, he took his seat. "Officer Rice," Amelia began, "can you please state your position and how you became involved in this case?" Rice nodded. "I'm a member of the local police department, specializing in family and domestic cases. I became involved when Ms. Maria Daniels, a neighbor of Ms. Walker, contacted us with concerns about Emily's safety." Leela's face drained of color. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, as though to anchor herself. Amelia continued, "What did your investigation uncover?" Rice cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Over the course of several weeks, we conducted surveillance and interviews. We documented multiple incidents of neglect, including Emily being left alone for extended periods and evidence of physical discipline inconsistent with acceptable parenting practices." The courtroom murmured, and the judge called for order. "Can you elaborate on these findings?" Amelia pressed. "Yes," Rice replied, his tone grim. "On 2 occasions, neighbors reported hearing shouting and loud crashes from the residence. We also found records showing missed medical appointments for Emily's treatment, and on 1 occasion, we found Emily wandering the neighborhood after being locked out of the house." Leela's composure cracked further. She leaned toward Victor, her voice an urgent hiss. "Do something." Amelia's questioning pressed forward. "And did you confront Ms. Walker about these findings?" "Yes," Rice confirmed. "When we questioned her, she became defensive and evasive. She claimed the reports were exaggerated and that Emily was simply difficult. However, her explanations didn't align with the evidence." "Thank you, Officer Rice," Amelia said, turning to the judge. "No further questions." Victor stood for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Officer Rice, isn't it true that domestic investigations often rely on subjective accounts and hearsay?" Rice remained calm. "That can be the case, but in this instance, we had corroborating evidence, including medical records, witness statements, and surveillance footage." Victor frowned. "And yet, no formal charges were filed." Rice nodded. "That's correct, but our findings were sufficient to raise serious concerns, which is why we've cooperated fully with this custody petition." Victor had no further questions, and Rice stepped down. The weight of his testimony lingered in the air. The closing arguments. With all testimony complete, the courtroom braced for the final stage of the trial. Amelia rose first, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, we have presented overwhelming evidence of Ms. Walker's neglect and abusive behavior. Emily has bravely shared her truth, and the testimony of multiple witnesses has corroborated her experiences. This is not about assigning blame or punishment. It's about ensuring Emily's safety and well-being. Mr. Walker has demonstrated his commitment to providing a stable, loving home. We ask the court to prioritize Emily's best interests and grant custody to her father." As Amelia took her seat, Victor stood, adjusting his tie. His voice was firm, but carried an edge of desperation. "Your Honor, parenting is not an easy task, especially when faced with the challenges of raising a child with a serious illness. Ms. Walker has made mistakes, but mistakes do not equate to unfitness. She has been Emily's primary caregiver, and disrupting that bond would cause unnecessary trauma. We ask the court to consider alternative solutions, such as mandated counseling and monitoring, rather than uprooting Emily's life." Victor sat down, casting a glance at Leela, who stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. A child's choice. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Peterson leaned forward, addressing Emily directly. "Emily," the judge said gently, "before I make my decision, I want to give you one last opportunity to share anything you feel is important. This is your chance to speak freely." Emily hesitated, her small frame trembling slightly. Her advocate, Maria, gave her a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, Emily stood, her voice soft but steady. "I just want to feel safe," she began, her words sending a ripple through the room. "I love my mom, but I'm scared at home. I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to live with my dad because he makes me feel safe." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Lila's face crumpled, a mixture of anger and defeat flashing across her features. The verdict. Judge Peterson sat back, her expression thoughtful as she took a long pause. The room held its collective breath. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, it is clear that Emily's current living situation is not conducive to her physical or emotional well-being. The court grants full custody of Emily Walker to her father, Jack Walker, effective immediately. Ms. Walker is ordered to attend mandatory counseling and parenting courses. Supervised visitation will be arranged at the court's discretion. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into a mix of whispers and quiet sobs. Jack exhaled deeply, tears shining in his eyes, as he turned to Emily, who ran into his arms. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, holding her tightly. "You were so brave." Leela sat frozen, her hands trembling. As the bailiff approached to escort her out, she muttered, "This isn't over." Emily clung to her father as they left the courtroom together, a new chapter of her life beginning, free from fear and uncertainty. A new dawn, a fragile beginning. The sun had just begun to rise over the city as Jack Walker stood on the balcony of his modest apartment, looking out over the quiet streets below. The weight of the courtroom victory still rested heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, a glimmer of hope had taken root. Inside, Emily slept soundly in the spare room he'd prepared for her weeks before the hearing, a room filled with soft blankets, her favorite books, and little touches meant to remind her she was finally home. Jack sipped his coffee, his thoughts wandering to the months of preparation leading up to this moment. The evidence, the testimonies, and most of all, the bravery Emily had shown. His little girl, standing tall against the darkness she'd endured, had become his greatest source of inspiration. Adjusting to a new routine. The first few days were a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Emily was quiet, her steps tentative as she navigated her new environment. Jack had taken time off work to help her settle in, his focus entirely on making her feel safe. "Is this okay?" Emily asked one morning, holding up a plate she'd carefully set for breakfast. Her voice was soft, unsure, as if waiting for a reprimand that wouldn't come. Jack knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's perfect," "Sweetheart." "Thank you." Emily smiled faintly, the tension in her small frame easing slightly. As they ate together, Jack made a point of asking about her favorite meals, her favorite shows, and the little things that made her happy. Slowly, piece by piece, he began to see glimpses of the Emily he remembered, the shadows of the past. But not everything was smooth. The trauma Emily carried wasn't something that could be erased overnight. On her second night in the apartment, Jack woke to the sound of muffled cries. He rushed to her room, finding her curled into a ball under her blanket, her body trembling. "Emily," Jack said softly, kneeling beside her bed. "It's okay, I'm here." She peeked out from beneath the blanket, her cheeks streaked with tears. I had a bad dream," she whispered. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jack asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "It was about Mom. She was yelling at me, saying I ruined everything." Jack's heart broke at the fear in her voice. He sat on the edge of her bed, pulling her into a hug. "You didn't ruin anything, Emily. None of this was your fault. You're safe now, I promise." As he held her, he silently resolved to do whatever it took to help her heal, building a foundation of trust. Over the next few weeks, Jack worked tirelessly to create a sense of normalcy. He enrolled Emily in a new school, met with her teachers, and arranged for her to continue her therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma. He also made sure to spend time doing the things Emily loved. One Saturday, he took her to the park, the same one they used to visit before the divorce. At first, Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, as if expecting her mother's voice to cut through the calm. But as Jack encouraged her, she slowly began to explore. "Do you remember the swings?" Jack asked, pointing to the set they used to visit. Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You used to push me really high." Jack chuckled. "Do you want to try?" Her smile widened, and for the first time in years, Jack heard her laugh as he pushed her higher and higher, the sound filling his heart with joy. Unfinished business. Meanwhile, Layla's presence loomed in the background. Though the court had granted Jack custody, Layla's bitterness only seemed to intensify. She sent letters through her lawyer, demanding changes to the visitation schedule and accusing Jack of turning Emily against her. Each letter was more venomous than the last, and though Jack knew he couldn't ignore them, he chose to focus on Emily's well-being instead. Amelia, his lawyer, remained a constant source of support. "Don't let her drag you into a fight," she advised. "The court's decision is final, and her behavior will only work against her if she tries to contest it." Jack nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Layla's anger was far from spent. A new friend. One afternoon, Emily returned from school with an unexpected brightness in her eyes. "Dad, can I tell you something?" she asked, setting her backpack down. "Of course, sweetheart," Jack replied. "I made a friend today," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Her name is Mia, and she sits next to me in class. She said she likes my hair, even though I told her it's a wig." Jack smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's wonderful, Emily. I'm so proud of you." Emily hesitated, then added, "Mia said she wants to come over sometime. Is that okay?" "Absolutely," Jack said without hesitation. "We'll set up a day for her to visit. How does that sound?" Emily nodded eagerly, her smile brighter than he'd seen in a long time. Facing the storm. But just as things began to settle, the storm returned. One evening, as Jack and Emily sat down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Jack opened it to find a court officer standing there, holding an envelope. "Mr. Walker, this is for you," the officer said, handing him the document. Jack's stomach sank as he opened it, finding a formal notice of appeal filed by Leela. "What's wrong, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. Jack forced a reassuring smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just some paperwork I need to take care of." But as he tucked the notice away, he knew that the fight was far from over. Lila wasn't done, and he would need to summon every ounce of strength to protect the life he and Emily were building. A glimmer of hope. That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep, Jack sat at his desk, going over the appeal notice with Amelia on the phone. "She doesn't have a case," Amelia assured him. "The evidence is stacked against her, and the court's decision was solid. She's grasping at straws." Jack nodded, though the worry lingered. "I just want this to be over. Emily deserves peace, and she'll get it," Amelia said firmly. "You're doing everything right, Jack. Stay focused on Emily, and let me handle the rest." As Jack hung up, he glanced toward Emily's room. The soft glow of her nightlight spilled into the hallway, a symbol of the fragile new life they were building together. Despite the challenges ahead, Jack knew one thing for certain. He would fight for Emily, no matter what. Triumph and healing. The courtroom felt colder than usual as Jack Walker prepared for what he hoped would be the final showdown in the custody battle. Despite Judge Peterson's clear ruling, Leila had filed an appeal, alleging that the court's decision was biased and unjust. Jack sat quietly beside his attorney, Amelia Quinn, as the opposing side entered. Lila's expression was tight, her movements brisk as she avoided making eye contact with anyone, including her daughter. Emily sat with her court-appointed advocate, Maria, a safe buffer between her parents. She glanced at her mother, then at her father, her small frame stiff with anxiety. Jack caught her eye and gave her a reassuring smile, silently mouthing, "It's okay." Emily nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched her notebook. A mother's desperation. Leila's attorney, Victor, began the proceedings with his usual bravado, arguing that Leila had been misrepresented in the original hearing. He claimed that the evidence presented against her was circumstantial and that the testimonies were exaggerated. He leaned heavily on the idea that removing Emily from her primary caregiver was an unnecessary disruption. "She has cared for Emily throughout her illness," Victor stated emphatically. "While she may have made mistakes, these do not constitute unfitness. My client deserves a chance to rebuild her relationship with her daughter." As Victor spoke, Leila nodded, her posture rigid as though willing the court to believe every word. But her eyes betrayed her, a flicker of unease, a crack in her armor that hinted at the desperation beneath. The case for stability. Amelia stood next, her voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, this appeal is not about fairness or justice. It is about control. The petitioner has demonstrated a clear pattern of neglect and abuse, supported by overwhelming evidence. The original ruling prioritized Emily's well-being, and nothing presented here today changes that fact." Amelia turned to the judge, her tone softening. "This is not about punishing Ms. Walker. It's about ensuring that Emily grows up in a safe, nurturing environment. Mr. Walker has proven his commitment to providing that environment, and Emily herself has expressed her desire to remain with her father. We urge the court to uphold its original decision." A child's voice. The judge leaned forward, her gaze settling on Emily. "Emily, I know this has been a long and difficult process for you. If you feel comfortable, would you like to share anything with the court?" Emily hesitated, her small hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Maria leaned in, whispering something softly. Gathering her courage, Emily stood and walked to the witness chair. Her steps were slow but deliberate, her determination clear. Once seated, she took a deep breath. "I love my mom," she began, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared when I'm with her. She gets mad a lot, and it's not safe. My dad makes me feel safe." Her gaze shifted to her mother, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, I don't hate you. I just need to feel safe." The courtroom was silent as Emily's words hung in the air. Lila's face crumpled, her carefully constructed facade finally shattering. For the first time, the anger in her eyes gave way to something else. Regret, perhaps even shame. A parent's choice. As the proceedings continued, Jack noticed Leila growing increasingly restless. Her hands fidgeted, and her gaze darted between the judge, Emily, and her own attorney. Finally, as Victor stood to make one last argument, Leela raised a hand. "Wait," she said, her voice breaking. "Stop." Victor looked at her, startled. "Ms. Walker, No," Leela interrupted, standing. "I can't do this anymore." The courtroom froze as Leela turned to the judge, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Your Honor, I've been angry at Jack, at the court, at everyone, but mostly at myself. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I see now that holding on to this fight isn't helping Emily. It's hurting her." She took a shaky breath, her gaze falling to Emily. "I love you, sweetheart. I always will. But I see now that what you need, what you deserve, is to feel safe and happy. If living with your dad gives you that, then I won't stand in the way anymore." A new chapter. The judge's face softened as she addressed Layla. "Ms. Walker, your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and prioritize your daughter's well-being is commendable. This court will uphold its original decision, granting full custody to Mr. Walker. Supervised visitation rights will remain in place, contingent on your continued participation in counseling and parenting classes." Leela nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve. Jack turned to Emily, his arms open as she rushed into them, her small frame trembling with relief. "It's over," Jack whispered, holding her close. "You're safe now." The road ahead. The weeks that followed were a time of transition. Layla began her counseling sessions, and though her relationship with Emily remained strained, she seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding trust. Jack maintained the boundaries set by the court, ensuring that Emily's healing remained the priority. Emily flourished in her new environment. She excelled at her new school, joined a book club, and made more friends. Her laughter became more frequent, her smiles brighter. The nightmares that once haunted her began to fade, replaced by dreams of adventures and happy memories. One evening, as they sat on the couch reading, Emily looked up at her father. "Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Thank you for fighting for me," she said softly. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're worth every fight, Emily. Always. A future full of hope." Years later, Emily would look back on those turbulent days with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. The scars left by her mother's actions never fully disappeared, but they became part of her story. A story of resilience, love, and the power of second chances. Jack, too, found peace in knowing he had given his daughter the life she deserved. And though the road had been long and fraught with challenges, they faced the future together, bound by the unshakable bond of a father's love and a daughter's trust.